How to spot a bluff in poker is kind of like how to figure out if someone's lying to you. So, how do you really figure it out is not just based off of specific physical things that they do. There are some things that are tells that will give you a pretty good idea of whether someone's lying or whether someone's bluffing, but they're not really definitive, such as to some extent not being smooth. If someone is naturally a smooth person, that can be a tell if someone isn't very good at lying, but if someone's good at lying, that won't necessarily happen. And this also can be the case for poker, but I would not rely on it too much. Other kinds of tells would be being really still is actually a pretty good one, but people also be really still when they have a hand as well. To some extent, bad posture, things like that. These things are like kind of very small things that don't really tell the full picture, but really how you get both figure out if someone is bluffing and also lying is looking at the full picture is really the answer. You look at the full meaning of what they're saying in context with everything else they're saying. And what I mean by saying isn't just literally saying, it's can be literally saying, but it's also what their actions say. Like in poker, it's really more what the actions say. So in the case with poker, you look at the summation of all their different actions, both physically at the table, how they place their bets, if they're still or not still in hands, if their pulse is going. That's actually a pretty big tell, but it can also mean if someone's nervous. But maybe if somebody has a really big hand, you notice that their pulse doesn't move, or if they have some mediocre hand, their pulse doesn't move, but it moves a lot when they are bluffing. That can be the case, but it's not always the case. Like, it's just, again, an indication. But it can also be the case that someone is totally silent when they are bluffing, and they talk a lot when they're not bluffing, for example. This is where you look at the full picture. And the biggest way that generally you'll have to figure out if someone is bluffing is more through their bet sizings and their overall picture of their game plan. And there's absolutely a parallel in real life too. In poker, it means if they bet small, do they have a good hand? If they bet large, do they have a good hand? If they bet instantly, does that mean they have a good hand, or does that mean they have a bluff? And you have to put these pictures all together, and you have to put these pieces all together to figure out if somebody is bluffing or not. Perhaps somebody's bluffing will bet smaller earlier on, and the board doesn't change, and they bet large, or vice versa. And if you can see, the more information you get, the more pieces of the puzzle you can put together, and then you can figure out when one of the pieces doesn't match up, that someone's bluffing. Another example of someone who is likely to be bluffing is if they tend to be very trappy, and they tend to trap with their biggest hand. So you have to wonder if they're very aggressive when they keep betting all the way through, if they're where their bluffs are. It seems that likely their bluffs are in the range where they're betting all the time. There's a real life example that I have for you that some people might consider a white lie, but I don't consider it a white lie, which would be if you've made plans with somebody and they say, "Oh, I'm sick," but you know them well, and let's say there'll be a difference in how they text, right? If they really have a real good excuse, they'll give you a paragraph and they'll say, "I'm really feeling shitty and I have to go to the hospital, and no, I have the worst diarrhea and I started vomiting," and all this stuff. If on another time when they've decided to change their plans and they say, "Oh, I'm just not feeling that well," and they kind of take too long to respond or text you after, or there may be a difference in how they text in the first place as well. There's a pretty good chance they're lying in one of those instances, probably in the latter if I had to guess, because usually people would like to give more information when they're speaking the truth and can't create a full-blown story. Whereas when people are lying, in my personal guess is for sure not universally true. It takes more of a sick psychopath, in my opinion, to create a full-blown story and distort the truth really far. They're likely to give less information if they're lying, and they'll kind of walk over their words. And I personally think this would not be a white lie. This isn't really white. I would say it's just a lie. Are most poker players honest people, or are they really deceptive because they play a game that involves a lot of deception and they have to figure out how to take advantage of the other player? The truth may surprise you. I would say that if we're talking about live poker players that came from kind of a hustling background, that have been playing poker for a long time, they will tend to be more of the secretive and manipulative type and to find tricky ways to gain an advantage. I will say that there's a lot of live poker players that don't fall into that category at all, that are at least influenced by this new school of poker players that looked at poker as like a game, a strategy game, and not any different from any other game to be won through one's own competitive advantage. And so they looked at it more of through the lens of an honest lens and thought to themselves, okay, I'm just going to be legit good and win. A lot of these guys are the guys that play online, where the only thing you can really rely on if you're going to play the toughest online games is being the actual fucking best. And so those guys actually really are not very manipulative, pretty much not liars at all. And a lot of those guys from the online crew have either influenced the live crew, or the live crew, a lot of the live crew has leaned in that direction of basically thinking, okay, this is basically a competitive game, and they're going to use their own like honest skill in order to win, and not do things that basically boil down to cheating, whether they're like officially against the rules or not, boil down to manipulative behavior to gain an unfair advantage or other people. So actually, most poker players that are successful in my experience are not deceptive. And I believe the reason why they're not deceptive is because they look at poker as a game where their skills are going to prevail over everyone else's, and a mind sport essentially that is meant to be won and not something to be gained some kind of weird unfair advantage from. On Twitter recently, I posed a question meant to be said as, is poker a mind sport that is a game that is played to be competitively, to be won fairly, or is it gambling where people just play for fun and hope they win and there's no strategy involved? Now, I think you guys know that there's obviously strategy involved and you can win. However, that's not exactly everyone's perspective on it, especially people that have created large barriers, such as many legislations and many governments banning poker. And often I hear from other poker players that, like, why do these guys like think poker's gambling? It's obviously not, and blah, blah, blah. At some point it occurred to me that actually this is a little bit irrational, because first of all, there's plenty of people that don't treat poker as a mind game and look at it as something where they can gamble and hope to win, or at least it's not like 100% like a competitive thing for these people. What's even more damning, in my opinion, is that many poker players will do things in order to manipulate these guys into losing more, or like take advantage of these players that are not particularly on the same level or don't know the same thing. And they also engage in various degenerative behaviors, such as flipping. I mean, even I've flipped now and then, but I'm pretty disciplined on that, partly because I realized to myself, shit, this is such a waste of time to flip for my money and all that and just hope that I win. The point being that if it's meant to be treated like a mind game or a sport that is open to the public, it should really be taken seriously to do so. And probably these guys actually have a legitimate reason to ban it, given that it has a lot of things that look like it's similar to gambling. If we want it to be more like a mind sport versus something that is degenerate, we should make it more like it's doing something productive, and that's actually doing a thing and exercising ourselves like an actual sport is, but for our mind. And we should not do things that are completely pointless, such as flipping, and also not be really predatory on people, because that's not what sports are for, obviously. And we should step away from gambling and move it more closer to games such as chess, maybe even backgammon, for example, which is not really considered gambling too much. Here are 3 tips for you if you're a beginner. The first one is get your pre-flop right. If you're really like a very first beginner, you need to play tighter than what you think. But if you can get your pre-flop pretty close to what it's supposed to be, you're probably going to win, to be honest. As long as your post-flop is relatively in line, meaning whatever happens after the flop for those of you who are very first beginners. The second thing is to attack people's weak ranges, meaning when people have very weak hands, to put pressure on them. It's really that simple, because people are just way more likely to fold when they have crap, and that matters more than what you're representing, to be honest, and more than even how strong your range is. But that would matter next, is how strong your actual range is. But the first thing would be, when it comes to bluffing, just try to win all these small pots and see how people respond to you. If they're good, they're going to start calling you more. And some examples would be just checks to the river, you just bet. Most positions, but ideally when you're in position, or excuse me, in one of the, in not the big blind against like early position or late position, etc. You want to do it where your range is actually strong and you were the one who initially raised in the first place into the pot, which tends to mean that your range is strong. So the last tip, and this is a bit of a complicated one, but to think of your hands, and this goes towards playing post-flop, but to think of your hands as certain kind of categories, to put them into categories, and to think when you're of your overall strategy as, okay, which of all these categories are going to go where to exploit my opponent? I'll give a few examples of this, but one example is a pretty straightforward one, but there are certain qualities of hands that are really big and that can go for 3 bets or more, such as top pair, top kicker. These are normally just played with a bet line, and you just try to get 3 shoots of value out of them. There are ones that can be that you can get more out of, such as sets and two pairs and straights and things like that, and flushes. And now you have to decide where to put those in order to capture as much value as possible from your opponent. This is a bit tricky, but not incredibly difficult. And when you're thinking about this, you also want to think about all the times you have mediocre hands, how you're going to protect them. And you'll also have lots of bluffs, and they're not all the same because you can have flush draws, you can have straight draws, you can have nothing, but you can have nothing that has no blockers at all. And you can have nothing that's not blocking some of the best hands that people can have. And you can also have nothing that has ace high, and you can have nothing that has a blocker if a flush draw gets there or a straight draw gets there as well, that blocks a little bit of what your opponent can have. And this is where things start to approach where play becomes closer to professional, but you need to be thinking a little bit like this in general and get used to this idea in order to get the foundations of playing reasonably well at the poker table. And the fourth bonus tip is to join a community of like-minded poker players. Don't play the game alone, and have a group of people that will support you on your journey, for which there is the Jungleverse, which of course is there to help assist you in all your goals in poker and to help you become rich. So join the Jungleverse now, click the link below, and let's all get rich together.